Okay, good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome. Today we'll be talking about Stratum viewer calculations and using MDX for those calculations, and then we've got a heavy emphasis on some advanced concepts, and we'll be talking about those after we review a little bit. But that's our agenda today. We wanted to talk about how to define calculated measures. Of course, we'll review that pretty quickly. And then we'll talk about, the build, we'll review the calculation expression window, and then we'll jump right into some of the MDX, the functions that are heavily used, some Stratum viewer functions that are there for you as well, and then talking about how you can use some of these other things, such as your attributes and your dimensions and members into your calculations. We'll talk about some of the count functions, ranking, and then we'll look at some advanced calculation examples, some interesting things that you can do, and then we'll demonstrate some of those concepts. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Calculated measure items are a big part of the view, as you well know. Whenever you're analyzing data, typically you always want to calculate against it and do some variances, variance percentage, all kinds of different things. Obviously, a viewer gives you the ability to do that and create these calculations and add them into your columns and rows of your Stratum viewer data grid. Calculations can be created by advanced users, view administrators, and security administrators, so that they can go in and actually add in their own calculations. When you build a calculation, the syntax that you use is actually called MDX, which is a Microsoft technology. It's basically just the necessary syntax to get the data from the cube and to basically manipulate it accordingly to how you want to calculate some of the different things within your view, which is basically objects from the analysis services cube. When you run a view, every time you run a view, it actually generates MDX behind the scenes to extract the data from that view and whatever measures that you want to retrieve along with their calculations. That's all done behind the scenes by this language called MDX. Whenever you, so basically to right-click a calculated measure item, you'll, anywhere on the data grid, you can right-click and do an insert. Depending on where you are, of course, it will insert that measure to the right and will allow you then to go ahead and create that calculation. You could, of course, use your View Explorer to do the same thing. So whether you're in the data grid or within the View Explorer, either way, you can insert a calculated measure item. And when you do that, and there's the View Explorer snapshot, of course, where you can go in and do the same thing there within the View Explorer. So, some good redundancy there. When you build a calculated measure, you'll have, as you can see, quite a bit of properties there to play around with for your calculated item or measure. First of all, the caption expression is something that you'll change typically, and you'll name that whatever you want the column header to display as. I notice a lot of customers changing the actual name. You don't want to do that. You want to leave that first area there alone, that first row. It's the second row that will actually tell the column header what to use for its heading. So as you can see, sales percent change. Now you need to click on that button in order to go in and change that caption expression. I also see a lot of folks highlight this this expression where, right here in the window, and that's not going to work. They'll highlight it and they'll press the back button, and next thing you know, the browser has taken them back a page, and they're confused. So I always tell them, well, you got to click on the button or the ellipse, whatever you want to call it. You got to click on that guy, and then that'll bring up a new window so that you can go ahead and change your caption expression. But that's really what's going to dictate what shows up in the column header. The type of calculation by default is calculated. You can choose a distinct calculation. We'll talk about that in a second. But that is really what drives whether it's a regular calculation or a distinct calculation. The one below that is the actual expression of the calculation. So if you wanted to change the expression, you can click on that button there, and it will bring up the expression window and allow you to change the expression. The format string is pretty important too, because whenever you add in a calculation, it doesn't format the data. It presents it in a raw format. So you'll need to go in and select a particular format depending on the calculation It could be a percent sign, or it might include the US dollar or the money sign, depending on what it is that you're calculating. So the format string and the caption header really are the two primary things that you'll change when you add in a new calculated column. The other things here are more optional, but drives whether the value of the calculation is actually hidden or not, whether there's an image within the actual column. Typically that's not used here. Conditional formatting can be turned on, and that's typically something that is used quite heavily in terms of a conditional format. You can have a pop-up expression, so when they hover over that column, they'll get some syntax or some a tooltip telling them what's going on with either the conditional format or the calculation itself. You can add a hyperlink to the column. We're not going to talk about that today, but as you can see, all kinds of different other options here. Do you want to hide the column? Do you want to filter on the data? Do you want to sort the data? Of course, you could do that after the fact once you add in the calculation. Do you want it to be totaled? And as you can, as you well know, each measure you can control the totaling for each measure, so that's obviously available too here. So really, that's it. I mean, in terms of adding the calculation, normally you'll go in and change the caption expression, and you'll add in a format string so that it looks good and is cosmetically, pleasing. Okay, so when you add a calculation, as I stated a little bit earlier, you can add in a distinct calculation. Well, what's the difference between the two? Normally when you're using time range, you won't use a distinct calculation because you're not dealing with the time as a hierarchy. Time as a hierarchy does, repeat calculations, based on the time. If you're showing multiple years, the calculation will naturally just repeat itself across the years. If you don't want it to do that, you can choose distinct calculation, and then the actual calculation is performed once. It's not really going to repeat itself across the members of time. When you use a distinct calculation, though, however, you're limited in terms of where you can put it. Normally, it has to be positioned before or after all the regular and calculated measures that are already in there. So, you don't have the flexibility of putting it anywhere. So there are some limitations according to that. Here's an example. For instance, if you use a calculation, like I said, with time as a dimension, you'll notice that my percent of total is naturally just going to repeat itself for each year that I have in my year months dimension. If you don't want it to do that, maybe you just want it to do for one particular year or whatever the case might be, you could use it as a distinct calculation and then choose which year you want to do the percent of total on. And then obviously notice how it's moved it to the last column here because of the fact that it's distinct, and it has to either be after my regular measures or I can put it as my first column as well. But I can't put it in between the columns of 2007 and 2008. It won't allow me to do that. So again, with distinct calculations, it's only going to calculate once. It's not going to repeat itself across 2002, 2007, and 2008 in this case, in which it normally would do if it was not a distinct calculation. So it gives you more, freedom in terms of, how many calculations you want. However, it does limit your freedom in terms of where you can put it. When you bring up the calculation expression window, it comes up. As you can see, you can start building the calculations in the calculation builder area, and then you do get access to the dimensions and the measure groups and the functions that are available for you in the left menu. Some calculation examples, normally, average sell price, where you can take dollars over units. It can be as simple as just taking your measures for your dollars, / for division, and then putting your units under it. That's a very easy one to create. If you're multiplying or dividing by 0, you can use an if function to say if my denominator is 0, then make this comma or this calculation cell null. Otherwise, go ahead and take my dollars over my units. So that's one way to do that. There's another way to, of course, do that as well. Here's the syntax to that if statement. So it's pretty simple, if this particular measure equals 0, comma, null, comma. So you have an if, then, else type of a situation, which is basically what the syntax up here represents. And you can nest if statements. I mean, you can really go nuts with, some of the logic that you build into your if statement, and certainly you can nest them. But don't forget, you don't have to use the if statement. We actually have these Stratum viewer functions that are available that you can use. For instance, divide with zero check. We'll do the division for you, and we'll check for zero as well. And it's less syntax and easier to use. Or percent of change, which basically kind of does the same thing. So the logic's already built into the function to check for your zeros. And it's easier to use and less syntax. So don't forget to use your Stratum viewer functions, and we'll take a look at some of those as well in terms of like some of the ABC calculations that you can do too. Here's an absolute value function. So if ever you want to, if you're storing negatives, like returns typically, returns data can be stored as a negative. You can use your absolute value to represent the data as a positive. So that's obviously a really easy function to use. Again, using the if statement, we're basically doing returns as a percent of sales. So we can use the if statement to check for divide by zero, or we can use the divide by zero function, and then we also want to use the absolute value function as well. Here's that syntax. So basically, if the sales amount minus my absolute value of my return amount equals 0, then make it null. Otherwise, do an absolute value of my return amount over my sales amount minus my absolute. So it's basically like a percent change, or a difference, a variance percent between sales and returns. So an if statement and an absolute function, absolute value function in the mix here. Okay, so basically your Stratum functions, don't forget about those. They're accessed within the function menu, and by expanding your Stratum viewer folder, you'll get access to the ones that are currently available. If you're not up on 6.2 or 3, you may not have all of these. So, and we're constantly adding more to this library of functions. The percent of change function will give you basically the percent of change between two measures. So all you have to do is select your percent of change function and then select your two measures from your measure group area, and it will do the percent of change calculation for you. Notice I don't have to do the math. I just select the actual function and select the two measures that I want to do the percent of change on. So it makes it real simple. You can use calculations with your attributes or your pickup fields. So this is something that I see quite often where a customer wants to use maybe a cost bucket, or maybe a date field that they're currently storing maybe at the item or the customer levels. Descriptions, standard cost, list price, expiration dates, all kinds of different things that you can use in your attribute fields. Normally you can use the val function too, because basically these pickup fields or these attribute fields are stored as text. So the val function will convert it to numeric for you, so then you can go ahead and do the calculations against your measures, such as my standard cost this year times my units to get an extended standard cost amount. My current list price can be calculated against my against my units to get an extended list price. Or I can do a date difference here between now or today, and how many days difference between today and my first sales order, or a pickup field for any of my order fields dimensions, or maybe I have some date fields for like an expiration date for my items. So all kinds of different things that you can do with date difference. And in this case, you can do days, or you can put in a W for how many weeks and how many months, perhaps, are difference between these two dates that you're between now, today, essentially, and the date that you'll find in your database. Other cool things that you can do you'll notice that sometimes you'll get an error that basically appears when you're doing a calculation against a pickup field. In this particular view down here, if I'm calculating against the pickup field at the product level, notice I'm at division level, I'm going to get this error, which basically, is basically the product saying I can't do the calculation because you're not at product level. Well, there's a remedy for that. If you can notice that you can use an if statement and then check what level you're at. Notice how, in this case, I'm telling it, well, if I'm at product level, essentially by using this syntax, if product.product.currentmember.level.name equals product, or in essence you're saying if I'm at product level, then yes, go ahead and do this math, do this calculation against my attributes, otherwise make it null. So now when I'm at that division level, I don't get the error, I just get an empty field here because I'm not at product level at this point. So there's the same calculation that we just kind of looked at. So once you do drill to the product level, then you'll have that calculation. It'll actually show up. I don't have an example of that, but that's basically what would happen. Is once you drill from division to product, you would then see the calculation appear. So checking what level you're at, is a very common thing. I see customers do that quite a bit to enhance the calculation, to make it more intelligent, so that the calculation knows when to actually do the calculation versus when to ignore it or just to put a null value out there. So that current member.level.name is the important syntax there in terms of trying to decide or tell it what level you're at before it pursues the calculation. Here's that date diff again. So this is pretty powerful because you can actually do a difference between two date fields. In this case, I'm doing a date difference between today or now, which is the function that will give you today's timestamp. And that comes from your computer, whatever computer you're using. The timestamp will actually come from the system date. And then notice how I'm using a pickup field last use date. So when the product was last used date and today. Which will give you a good idea when the product was last used and how many days difference that was. Okay, so that's very, very powerful. We have many customers using this to do many different things, to be honest with you. So the date difference is actually a very powerful format or function. Here we go with the, kind of breaking down the syntax here for that date diff, where you can tell what interval that you want to see the difference between the two dates. And you can use D or M or W for weeks, M for months. You can kind of dictate, what your interval is going to be. So that one's used quite a bit. We see that quite a bit out there. If you use time as a hierarchy, and I'm sure that many of you do in Viewer, even with time range today, there are views that typically warrant time being used as a hierarchy, a lot of trending views and whatnot. You can use calculations using your members of time. And so we normally see that quite often, where you can tuple your member of time together with your measure in order to give you like year-to-date or month-to-date sales. So here we have an example where I'm choosing my time hierarchy, and I'm choosing current week, and then I tuple that in with my sales amount measure, and I'm able to do a calculation with current week sales. And I could do current month sales or today's sales, basically by using the same methodology. And I can have different rows and different flavors of time within each row, or essentially within each measure here that I'm calculating. This was a concept that was used quite heavily in the prior versions of Viewer because time range was not yet available. So if you had to have different flavors of time for each measure, then normally you would have to go through this to do that. And again, with time range now available, this is something that is not as heavily used, but is still available, of course, and you can still segment out your time ranges or your time dimensions and use them accordingly here in these calculations. So this is still available, and you can still do this in 6x as you toggle between time range and then just using time as a hierarchy. Here's a cool one. Sometimes we'll get a question, can I show sales from another dimension, and if so, and also for just a particular entity. So in this case, we've got product family 50, and we're tupling that in with a time range measure in order to show basically product family 50. Notice I'm at rep broker, and I can see how the reps are selling that particular product family, even though I haven't drilled to that level. And it does that, again, based on the tuple and the member that you pick for product family in this case. So as you can see, it's pretty easy to calculate, different members and to tuple those in with the measures. So you can, in this case, identify one particular product family and what the sales are for that product family at rep broker or the sales rep level. So that's something you can't do in Viewer or, or Planner or DB View. This is Viewer's ultimate flexibility, is this ability to kind of do some of these things. Here I'm showing several product families in a calculation. So I'm using a sum function to do that, where I'm summing up two members, in this case product family 50 and product family 51. And I'm using the sum function to say, basically I want the sum for these two product families for actual sales. Notice the squiggly there, the French accent, that's what that is. And you can use the sum function to sum across those two members. But the French accents are there to group together your members. This is what we call a set. It's basically more than one member. And the French accents will keep your set together. There's your comma, and there's your measure, and there's the closing of your sum function. So now this will sum product family 50 and 51, and it will show your sales for both of them. Okay, and it will look like this, essentially. Here's another heavily used one for checking in terms of time. You know where you are in terms of time. For example, many customers have their columns of time range set to show them year to date to previous month. Well, if you're on a calendar and you're going from January to previous month, that's not going to work out so well, because that's an invalid time range. So what we've suggested some customers do is have a calculation out there that basically checks to see what month they're in. So I'm saying if my month of today or now equals 1, which would be January in this case, then go ahead and show last year's sales, all of last year's sales. Otherwise, if it's not January, essentially show January to my previous month, which in this case happens to be August. So this nullifies or gets rid of any invalid time range errors that you might see, which can cause some issues as well. So if you ever want to do this year to date to previous month, this is probably something you'll need to pursue so you can avoid having invalid time range errors on your first month of whatever fiscal, or whether you're using calendar. And you can kind of tell by using this powerful date function and figuring out where you are in terms of today, and you can kind of dictate what shows up within the view. So here's the actual calculation, and notice that we're not in the month of January in this particular view, so it's going to revert and show me January through August as opposed to last year's. So that's how you can kind of avoid some of those time range issues. Counting. Do you ever want to show counts of products for the customers how many products that the customers are purchasing from you is a good example of why you might want to use counts. Or how many customers do you have by region? All kinds of fun, cool things you can do with the count function. And here we are using the count function to show how many distinct products that my customers are purchasing from me. So here at product level, and I can see by using my count function, and then I'm cross-joining that with my product dimension, and basically saying, show me all the products that have data for sales units, because the exclude empty will actually exclude any intersections there that don't have any data, because obviously you don't want to see how many products. You'll have that same number then going down the screen. So by using the exclude empty, it actually just shows you the products that have sales for these customers. But that's real cool too, because then at this customer level, I can get a really good feel for how many customers have more of a diverse, purchase habit. How many different products are they purchasing from me without having to drill to item to see that. Here's a cool one. If you ever do percent of total, you can actually control whether it does a percent of the grand total or percent of subtotal. Now, I get this question. As a matter of fact, I just got it from a customer several weeks ago, and they were asking to do the same thing. I just want to do a percent of total for each of my subtotal breaks. So here we can see that, by default, it does the subtotal or the achievement percent, depending on what it is. But basically, you can kind of control that. I have a view out here that actually calculates the percent of total for each subtotal. what that entails is you actually have to build in you have to do a max for each one of your customer sold tos in this example, and for the sales, that measure that you're using for your view. So in this case, I'm using the max, and then from that max, I'm able to calculate and do an achievement percent for that that sales amount over that calculation that does the max. And that's really kind of what does the calculation for you. So you can actually see the subtotal for each customer break as opposed to for the grand total. I have a view that actually shows you how to do this, and we'll take a look at that. But the max function is pretty important here in terms of figuring out what the max amount is for each subtotal break for your customers in this example. Counting, and then there's ranking. So you can actually do a rank based on some of the measures you have. In this case, I can see my customers and how they rank for sales. So I'm basically showing a rank function there with my customers, and then ordering them based on the rank, and essentially showing them my ranking here. Here's the right, left, middle function. This is heavily used for dates and manipulating whether you want to show the date in a specific format. Maybe you're storing it as YYYMMDD, but you may want to show it as month, day, and year, as you can see within the view. So I went from this format to this format by using my right, mid, left function. And notice the plus sign and the double quote there and the forward slash there. It's basically my way of saying append this in so we can get those forward slashes into my dates. So that's pretty important too there in terms of showing the syntax and telling the calculation what to add in as basically just basic text. So you can do some pretty cool stuff with that too. In this case, we were able to format my date accordingly. So right, mid, left. I also had a customer who wanted to do a filter, and they wanted all the particular items that began with certain series of numbers because that meant something to them. That was able to return certain sections of products, and we were able to use again the left function in a filter by expression to actually accomplish that. So many different applications for the the right, left, and the middle functions there. Here's our cast date function. This function will convert a string to a date format. So, again, instead of doing the right, left, and mid, you can actually use the convert or cast date and convert that to your date as opposed to just doing the right, left, mid. It might be easier actually to do that. Here's the date converted, and it's cleaner as you notice. The first sales order, that's basically using the right, left, mid, whereas the date conversion actually just shows you a cleaner version of that without the zeros in front of the month and the date there. So it might be cleaner for you to actually do it using the cast or convert date. Okay, and then here's a really good one. This is something that's new, and I've seen some customers use this. It's a little more sophisticated, as you can see. There's quite a bit of syntax involved, and this is only a third of the syntax. But you might find this quite helpful because I think that many of you have probably been down this path before, and that is, if you're storing inventory and you want to see what's available for your items, and then you drill to a customer, and lo and behold, your inventory number goes away because you're not storing inventory data by customer. Well, there's actually a way around that, and you'll notice that there's actually a calculation that you could use to kind of get around that, and it's a three-part calculation. The first part will act as a relationship filter for the calculation. So basically, it says just show me the data where there's actual data. I don't really care to see any empty cells. So that's basically what you're doing here. Is you're saying if my measure equals null, and if both of these members or these measures equal null, and you're basically going through all of them and saying all of these measures, if they're all null, then make this null. Otherwise, go ahead and do the magic in terms of showing me the data. So that kind of controls your relationship, your data relationship. The second part of the calculation will determine if the product hierarchy is not part of the drill down path. So you'll have a calculation in there that will actually show you, and we'll check to see if there's a drill down path, whether the customer, or I'm sorry, whether the product hierarchy is not part of the drill down path. And that's really what this portion does down here. If product.current member is product default member, then make it null. Otherwise, go ahead and do the math. The third part then is the part of the expression where it ignores order type, and that's kind of what this does down here. So we're going to take a look at this in a view. What would happen is you could have customer sold to filtered in your view. In this case, we've got it up in the view filter. And then we're able to show DC warehouse and product. So our DC is Omaha, and our products there's 4 different items here. And I can still see my open order amounts. I can still see, sales amount. But notice how I can see my available inventory for each one of my items, even though I'm filtered by customer sold to. So that's the magic. I mean, that's exactly what we're trying to achieve here by doing that math. We're able to go ahead and show my available inventory even though I'm filtered on a certain series of customers or a given customer. So now you have a good feel for how many items you have available. This is what's on order for that customer for these items, and then you have a good feel for what's available in inventory for that given warehouse. So that's very powerful, and I really do think that you can use quite a bit of that. We're going to look at that further in our demo. Here is whenever you're calculating, typically against like a pickup field or an attribute, be careful because you'll actually calculate against all your items. So you can control that by doing an if statement and checking to see if sales, in this case, that measure is null. Because if it is, you can have it ignore it, and then you can go ahead and do the ranking or the calculations. So just a simple suggestion here in terms of checking for nulls or checking to see if there's any sales at all before you do some of these calculations, because that way you can significantly speed up the calculation. All right, so let's go to our demo, and what I want to show is essentially some of these concepts. So if I go into some of my views here, here's my customer scorecard, and what this does, it'll show you that percent of total within each subtotal break. So here we can see my percent of total here, and you'll notice that percent of overall total. And let me go ahead and I'm going to expand this out. Okay, so we expand this out. Here's my percent of group total. So notice that my percent of overall total is, this particular group, customer type A, and these groups of customers are 44% of the entire total. However, my percent of group total shows me that this particular customer is 40% of this particular group. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, if we take a look at this and we edit that calculation, we can see that we're doing that just like we did in the PowerPoint, where we have to figure out what this calculation is first, and that will be the subtotal amount for each customer type group. So once we figure that out, and that'll have that max in it. And here's that calculation, because it's basically hidden. That calculation's hidden. You don't necessarily need to show it, but you got to have it in order to do the percent of total within the subtotals. And there you have it. With that max function for each one of my customers, I want to show the max amount for that sales amount. So if we show that, let's go ahead and show that, because I think it will be helpful for you to see that. And there it is. Notice how it's basically just giving me the max amount, essentially the subtotal amount for the customer sold to, for each one of my breaks. And that is how I'm able to figure out percent of the total within each subtotal, because that's all that does. It gives me the amount of the subtotal for the sales amount. Notice how it equals my subtotal amount over here for sales for each one of my subtotals. So it's not as hard as it looks. It really isn't. You know, this is, you know, as you dissect some of these functions and these calculations, they're really not as intimidating as you might think. So here all I'm doing is I'm calculating sales over my max amount to get my percent of group total. Here's also my ranking. So here I can see a ranking within each grouping as well. So let's take a look and see what we're doing to do that. And here it's just simply the rank function, and then I'm specifying my level, and then I'm telling it to basically use sales for the ranking, the sales member or the sales measure for that ranking. So then I get a rank between for each one of my breaks there. If I roll this up to customer type, let's see what happens for my ranking. And as you can see, ranking goes away because I'm not at customer level at this point, so it can't figure out my rank. So once I drill down to the ranking for my subtotal or my my customer sold to, I'm able to see those rankings. If I drill in a particular customer type, here I can see the ranking for that particular customer type, or I can drill in on all. Either way, obviously, it's going to show me the ranking for each different customer type break. Okay, so a lot of cool things with that. Here's the calculation that we just talked about in terms of it ignoring. Here it's asking me pick a customer account. So I'm going to go in and select a given customer once I find one. So here I can choose like Harrington's Eastern, and I'll add them into the mix. I click OK. I click OK, and then it runs the view. So here's my view, and notice that in my view filter is that Harrington's account, Harrington's Eastern, and then I can see for DC, Omaha, and for my products, lo and behold, check that out, I can actually see my inventory. So I can see all the customer-related information about the open orders for these products for that customer, and obviously then I can see my available inventory as well. How do we do this? Well, like I said, it was that three-part calculation approach. And this is kind of cool because it's broken out into different 3 sections here within the actual calculation. We've got some documentation in there as well. Which, by the way, as you can see, you can add your documentation directly into the calculation. By using the // you can then go ahead and write anything you want after that and document your calculation. So basically our first thing is only do the calculation if data exists for the row, and that's what we're doing here. If my open orders amount is null and my open orders is null. So basically if these 2 measures that are in the mix are null, then make it null. Otherwise, then if the product is null and we aren't at the product level, so don't try to find the on hand. And so that's basically what we're doing. We're just checking to see if product is null and we aren't at the product level. So we're doing if product current member is product default member, then make it null to do that. And then finally, ignore the customer dimension. So by using this syntax here, we're telling it basically to ignore the customer dimension for our on-hand amount, our inventory. So that's all there is to it. So if you follow these rules here, and depending on the measures that you're using and the dimensions that you're using, you can do it pretty much for anything. And in this case, we're able to show our available inventory, even though we're filtered on a particular customer account. So that's a very powerful calculation as well. Here's that 80-20. So if you're going to use, like for instance, if you want to do an 80-20 on an ABC classification on sales or gross margin or any of the measures that you have, I'm using my Stratum functions here and using my ABC cumulative percent to drive my 80-20, where I can see that 5%. You can control your breakouts here by using 80%, 95% as your breakout. I didn't want to add that in there. So here we can see that my A items are up to 80%, and then my B items are cut off at that 95% threshold there. Essentially giving me anything up to 80% as an A item. So that's kind of cool. If you do ABC classification or anything along those lines, you can use some of these ABC functions in order to do some of that. Okay. And then some of the other ones, like I said, if you wanted to show certain things by right-clicking and adding in a calculation, I can show certain measures or dimensions, even though I'm not at that particular level. So, for instance, if I add in product category or family, so now that's available in my view, and then I can make that. I can show a particular product family at customer sold to level. So here I would enter in a calculation. I would say I can use my sum function. So if I select my sum function, which is under my number or my numeric function folder, then I can actually build this pretty easily here. And then I'll pick the product families that I want to show. So I'll go and select their members. And maybe I want to show a couple of them, like 50 and 51. Okay, so that fills that in for my set. And oh, by the way, don't forget the French accents. So we have to enclose we have to close that in so we can build our set. And then we'll pick our measure. So we'll just pick sales amount. And that's it, really. I mean, if I validate this, hopefully it validates as being kosher. It is. So that's how easy it is. I just built a sum function using a set of two different product families and then tupled that in with my sales amount. So if I click OK, that's essentially going to show me the sales amount for those two product families at customer sold to level. So there's my new calculation, and sure enough, I've got to clean that up, obviously. So if I right-click that column header and go to Properties, I can then go into my properties of my calculation down here on the bottom, and my caption expression. If I click on that button there, I can very quickly name this, something along those lines. So that's my column header, and then my format string is going to be sales or dollars. So I'll pick a dollar format string. Okay, so I'll click OK to that, and there's my product family 50 and 51 sales. Even though I'm at customer sold to, I can see what the sales are for those two product families. And that's showing data from another level, even though we're not even drilled to that level of product family. So pretty simple, and again, if you double click on the column header, it takes you right back into the calculation. You can start working with that calculation. Any questions? Any questions or comments?
Thank you.
Any questions? Anybody have any questions about anything in terms of calculations? Wow, really no questions. I thought I'd get a lot more questions. All right, well, thank you, everyone. I appreciate your time today. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you at the next Insight in 2 weeks from today. Thanks, everyone.
The call will now end.